Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. As I continue to run from death, I would like today to address an article that recently appeared in the New Republic called An Old Approach to Health Reform by Daniel Callahan and Sherwin B. Nuland. This article I consider to be putting forth one of the most dangerous and misguided and ethically wrong series of recommendations within the public discourse of our time. The article is written in such a tone as to make it appear plausible to many people in mainstream discourse today. And in a sense, that makes it all the more dangerous, because some of the recommendations of Callahan and Nuland may be accepted and may be seized upon by people who wish to limit individual freedom, limit individuals' abilities to use their money to advance their own health, and also to limit the most noble and glorious human aspiration of them all, the desire to fight against death, to beat back death, to win even a little bit of extra life from it, though of course, ideally, we desire to win a lot more life. I'm going to go into this article in detail, because I think a lot of their errors need to be pointed out directly by reference to what they say. They begin the article with an error. They cite the, quote, great biologist René Dubos, who in 1959 wrote a book called Mirage of Health, in which he pointed out that, quote, complete and lasting freedom of disease is but a dream remembered from imaginings of a Garden of Eden. And this error is one that I'd previously discussed on this series, the idea that the desire to be free of death, or the desire to delay death even, is some kind of religious fantasy. That all it is human beings pining for some primeval bliss that an age-old mythology posits to have existed before some sort of equally mythical human fall. And this is simply not the case. The desire to be free of death is a very widespread desire, and indeed, it's a desire that's universally accessible to the human mind, because for any human being in virtually any condition, the benefits of life are so apparent, so tangible, that humans strive, irrespective of what nonsense or mythology they've been taught, to preserve this very wonderful existence and to improve it. And this desire to overcome death is one of the most ambitious parts of that human desire for survival, which hopefully is an unquenchable desire, sufficiently unquenchable that the likes of Callahan and Nuland will not be able to thwart it. Nuland and Callahan ask, what if there are no imminent, much less foreseeable cures to some of the most common and lethal diseases? What if, in individual cases, not all diseases should be fought? What if we are refusing to confront the painful likelihood that our biological nature is not nearly as resilient or open to endless improvement as we have long believed? And it's interesting that here and throughout the rest of the article, they don't really present very compelling evidence for this assertion. Indeed, they do not address the criticism of that implicit assumption, that status quo bias, from such individuals as Aubrey de Grey and Ray Kurzweil, who posited that yes, indeed, we can overcome the frailties of our bodies. Aubrey de Grey, by taking an engineering approach and looking at the 7 main kinds of damage that manifest themselves as senescence, and fixing that damage every now and then with ever-improving methods. And Ray Kurzweil by focusing on the advancement of computer technology and what all of that extra processing power, as well as capacity to undergo increasingly sophisticated functions, will bring in terms of our understanding of the world, our ability to solve problems, and our ability to enhance our own intelligence, essentially creating in the future a combination of all the strengths of human intelligence and all the strengths of artificial intelligence in what would be a transhuman being. Nuland and Callahan do not address any of these proposed programs for beating back senescence, as well as solving a lot of other problems in current societies. Their article is deficient in this way, but in omitting a discussion of these efforts, even to state that they disagree with them, Callahan and Nuland give a very misleading impression of the state of current and potential future progress. Aubrey de Grey's SENS Foundation is already making some impressive research breakthroughs. The Methuselah Mouse Prize has had winners in the past who have been able to extend the lifespans of mice considerably, as well as to reverse senescence evidence in certain experimental mouse populations. This is certainly not the extent to which we want to go in order to address the problems of death, disease, and decay, but these are very promising findings that this article ignores. Nuland and Callahan continue. They write, "Let us begin by pointing to some unpleasant realities, starting with infectious disease. 40 years ago, it was commonly assumed that infectious disease had all but been conquered, with the eradication of smallpox taken as the great example of that victory. That assumption has been proved false by the advent, for example, of HIV, as well as a dangerous increase in antibiotic-resistant microbes. Based on what we now know of viral disease and microbial genetics, it is reasonable to assume that infectious disease will never be eliminated, but only at best become less prevalent." This is a non sequitur. They note that there have been some setbacks in fighting infectious disease, like the emergence of HIV and certain antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria. This does not imply that the fight is in some way futile or unwinnable. Indeed, their own paragraph here suggests that it is possible to eliminate infectious disease, as smallpox has been eliminated, as polio has been eliminated via the Salk vaccine that emerged in the 1950s. So clearly it is possible to eliminate these diseases. Not every approach will work. Sometimes there will be unforeseen complications, as with bacteria developing antibiotic resistance. Sometimes new diseases might emerge, like HIV. But still, tremendous strides have been made in controlling the spread of HIV in countries that don't have broken regimes, and in enabling people with HIV to lead much longer lives. Right now, treatments are available that essentially enable patients with HIV to live for 30 years or more after getting the disease, without that being an imminent death sentence anymore. That's real progress. And indeed, recently, there has been a case of an individual who had HIV and now no longer has it. It's a very interesting and unique case, and I've linked to an article about it in the references section accompanying this presentation. But certainly, this provides hope that this disease too can be eradicated. I do not see any basis for espousing the defeatist attitude that Nuland and Callahan have put forth here, that just because not everything has turned out as was initially expected, which almost never happens in science, it means we should give up. Clearly, people have held incorrect theories of the world and incorrect expectations of where human societies would be in the future. And yet, despite all of that, progress has been made. And in some ways, prior expectations have shown to be insufficiently optimistic. Who could have in the 1950s predicted the massive transformative impact that the internet and personal electronic technologies would have on our lives today? Nuland and Callahan continue by writing that then there are chronic diseases, now the scourge of industrialized nations. If the hope for eradication of infectious diseases was misplaced, the hopes surrounding cures for chronic diseases are no less intoxicated. Think of the, quote, war on cancer declared by Richard Nixon in 1971. Mortality rates for the great majority of cancers have fallen slowly over the decades, but we remain far from a cure. Once again, with regard to the very real progress that has been made in declining cancer mortality rates, including dramatically declining mortality rates for certain kinds of cancer, they dismiss it with essentially a statement that because we don't have a cure yet, it hasn't worked. And also, they ignore the fact that a paradigm shift may be at hand as genetic technologies become a lot more cost-effective. Indeed, it has been observed over the past decade that the cost improvements in sequencing genomes are actually arriving at a much faster pace than would be suggested by a Moore's Law kind of phenomenon in computing. Gordon Moore in 1964 predicted that computers would roughly double in their processing power every 1.5 years or so. And in both computing technology and in biotechnology, the ability to perform vast amounts of computations has more than kept up with Moore's Law. This will certainly be of great help in identifying the root causes of certain cancers that are genetically based. And in that, there is great hope for improvement that Callahan and Nuland simply overlook. They continue by assailing even what is a fairly moderate position with regard to improving human life, the compression of morbidity mindset that has been critiqued by advocates of indefinite life extension from the other end as being insufficiently radical capable and insufficiently cognizant of the improvement that is possible. Nuland and Callahan write that one of the hardiest hopes in the chronic disease wars has been that of a compression of morbidity, a long life with little illness followed by a brief period of disability and then a quick death. So they see this as pretty much everything that their opponents have been trying to achieve, and they paint it as somehow one of the most ambitious hopes in the war against death. And that is simply not true. Simply getting a few extra years of healthy life, while not significantly increasing years of life in general, is certainly not what the movement for indefinite life extension stands for. The movement for indefinite life extension, indeed, would seek to enable human beings to remain biologically young indefinitely, as the damage of senescence is periodically undone, or, as medical science progresses even further, prevented. Nuland and Callahan continue by citing S.J. Olshansky, quote, a leading figure in longevity studies who has for some years expressed skepticism about the prospect of an indefinite increase in life expectancy. He calls his position a, quote, realist one, particularly in contending that it will be difficult to get the average beyond 85. He also writes that it is, quote, biased to assume that only positive influences on health and longevity will persist and accelerate. That view, he notes, encompasses a belief that science will surely keep moving on a forward track, a projection that is not necessarily true. Now, I will note on this that S.J. Olshansky is not the most objective source to comment on these issues. He has publicly expressed before his opposition to Aubrey de Grey's SENS project of finding the main causes of damage due to senescence and reversing them. Olshansky has expressed skepticism that this effort is even possible, and in the articles of Olshansky that I've read, it's essentially an argument from precedent. He states, well, for thousands of years, some thinkers have hoped to overcome death, and this has never happened, and now they're all dead. So Aubrey de Grey and people like him are just the next in this line of futile thinking. And this is, of course, a logical fallacy. The same kind of logical fallacy that renowned, quote, experts back in the late 19th century employed to state that powered human flight would never be possible because it had never been done before. Olshansky, I think, simply does not have the kind of ambitious ability to pose challenges to the status quo and to look outside of the possibilities within the status quo to see how life can be improved, not just accepting what is as the inevitable default state of things, which might only be tinkered with a little bit around the edges. And furthermore, it's true that there are no guarantees of scientific progress, but that does not take away the moral imperative for pursuing such progress. Indeed, there have been entire eras of degeneration in human history, but that awareness should only make us more determined to pursue the right course, a combination of behaviors, institutions, and sheer motivation that will enable this progress to continue and to accelerate, to enter or continue the kind of exponential growth that Ray Kurzweil hopes will bring us to a point of dramatically enhanced human and artificial intelligence. Nuland and Callahan do mention advances in life expectancy and in the treatment of certain diseases, but they then say these advances, however, should be balanced against another factor, the insupportable, unsustainable economic cost of this success. 20 years from now, the maturation of the baby boom generation will be at flood tide. We will have gone from 40 million Americans over the age of 65 in 2009 to 7 million in 2030. This will put enormous pressure on the healthcare system, regardless of whether Obama's reform efforts or even Paul Ryan's prove successful. Now, I must emphasize here that this is a very wrong view of cost. The view is the more medical science accomplishes, the more it's going to cost, and the cost will just continue to increase, and indeed increase while providing diminishing returns. This ignores completely how technologies actually disseminate to the general population. The fact is, as technologies become more widespread and more effective, they do not become more costly. Quite the opposite, they become a lot less costly. The first versions of any given technology are always quite experimental. They don't work very well, they're extremely expensive, only a few people can afford them, and most people don't see the benefit at all. As scientists and engineers work on these technologies and improve them, however, they also find ways to make them more cost-effective, to mass produce them, to make them available economically to larger and larger larger segments of the population. So as quality goes up, cost actually goes down. And according to Ray Kurzweil's discussion of this phenomenon, as the end result, technologies that follow this path become virtually costless. Think about email today as a great example. And more generally, think about computers and how enormous and expensive and unwieldy and very weak in terms of processing power they were in the 1940s or even in the 1960s. And compare that with how ubiquitous and inexpensive and intuitively accessible they are today. The same can be observed for any field of human endeavor, provided that there are no artificial barriers imposed in the way of this technology progressing. If medical costs, including the costs of medical technology, have failed to decline according to this pattern described by Ray Kurzweil, it is because of the many artificial interventions from the federal government that over the past 70 years have propped up those costs and have made healthcare artificially more expensive. It is not the innovation that is to blame for the costs. Indeed, without the innovation, the costs would be much higher, and the effectiveness of medical treatments would be much lower. But rather, the intervention. Nuland and Callahan cite such frightening figures as that the cost of Alzheimer's disease is projected to rise from $91 billion in 2005 to $189 billion in 2015 to $1 trillion in 2050. But that projection assumes the medical status quo, not just in terms of what technologies are available, but what will be the degree of novelty associated with these technologies. Essentially, Nuland and Callahan assume that all of the technologies that will be used to treat Alzheimer's disease will always and forever be at this highly expensive, highly unreliable experimental stage without ever entering a stage of broader mass distribution or even ubiquitous availability that we see with, for instance, generic drugs that one can purchase over the counter. And furthermore, of course, Nuland and Callahan assume that the same unsustainable institutional climate that we have now will continue to prevail into 2050 and just keep racking up more costs. They cite a 2006 article from Harvard economist David Cutler and his colleagues, who wrote that analyses focused on spending and on the increase in life expectancy, beginning at 65 years of age, showed that the incremental cost of an additional year of life rose from $46,800 in the 1970s to $145,000 in the 1990s. If the trend continues in the elderly, the cost effectiveness of medical care will continue to decrease at older ages. Now, once again, this may be an empirically true observation, but Nuland and Callahan fail to identify why it's true. And indeed, you will see that the reason this observation is true is the very sort of recommendation that Nuland and Callahan propose. The kind of centralized, top-down interventionism that characterizes our broken healthcare system and that has resulted in the severance of the doctor-patient relationship, the inability of patients to understand the nature and costs of the care that they are to receive and to make informed decisions accordingly, and the increased prevalence of rationing of care, be it by private insurance companies or by governments. Nuland and Callahan want to reduce the share of gross domestic product consumed by healthcare. And they ask, can we imagine a system that is less ambitious but also more humane, that better handles the inevitable downward spiral of old age and helps us through a somewhat more limited lifespan as workers, citizens, and parents? I would argue that they have their moral priorities backward. They want to directly reduce the costs by reducing the options available to people and the quality of treatment and the sophistication of treatment available to them, so that people have lower lifespans, but somehow, in their very misguided view of the world, that's going to be better. I suggest that that's the wrong system to focus toward. The moral priority should always be on human life first. Human life is the source of all moral value, and without human life, value would not be possible. So any other considerations, including considerations of monetary cost, are secondary and subordinate to the moral imperative of preserving human life. And by that I mean not just the greatest good for the greatest number, but preserving the life of every individual, because the life of every individual is of supreme moral value, provided that that individual is not himself a threat to the lives of others. Nuland and Callahan seem to think that some sort of reduction of suffering and compassionate acceptance of inevitable human decline should take moral precedence over the urgent and extremely high-stakes battle to delay and defeat death. And this is a fundamental moral difference between their view and the view of advocates of indefinite life extension. They continue by writing that the answer to that question of creating this, quote, more humane system is yes, but it will require, to use a religious term in a secular way, something like a conversion experience on the part of physicians, researchers, industry, and our nation as a whole. Now, here they're actually almost being explicit about the nature of their program, because what they are using is religious language. There's no way around it. The phrase conversion experience is inescapably religious. And I think their impulse is a fundamentally religious impulse, and not in a good way. It's essentially the impulse of don't tamper with nature, don't fight back against the inevitable, don't challenge the status quo, accept on faith that this is the inevitable and right way of things, that you will die, and then within that acceptance, we will provide you, quote, compassion. It's a mentality that has quite often characterized Christian thought, certainly, throughout the past 2 millennia, the acceptance of the inevitability and even desirability of widespread human suffering and death, and oh, here comes the church and the missionaries to comfort the afflicted. That's essentially the kind of society that Nuland and Callahan want us to live in, and that would be a tremendous retrogression, even compared to the society we have today. They continue by suggesting that scientific progress, even though by nature it is open-ended, should be limited because of the costs involved. They say that, quote, healthcare, like the exploration of outer space, will always be open to progress, but we understand that putting humans on Mars is not at present economically sensible. Well, to that I say maybe it's not economically sensible to NASA and other central government programs that have certainly not been able to accomplish such endeavors in a cost-effective fashion, but it is not off limits for private companies that have currently been making immense improvements in the technology needed to put humans into space. And of course, tomorrow, there will not be a private rocket taking people to Mars. But the trajectory of private contributions to human spaceflight over the past 7 years has been so impressive that I would not be surprised if a human being was sent to Mars by a private company by the end of this decade. Nuland and Callahan say that we have settled for a space station and the Hubble telescope. Well, who has settled? Humankind or just a few central governments? I would say their settlement applies to central governments only. The more ambitious among us have not abandoned the hope of eventually inhabiting other worlds. They write, we must now comparably scale down our ambitions for medicine, setting new priorities in light of the obstacles we have encountered. And to that I offer a firm no. How many lives will be lost in the interim as a result of these scaled-down ambitions? How many millions of people who could have been cured, given the technological possibilities of their time, would perish needlessly because of the callous desire of Nuland and Callahan to scale down our ambitions for medicine? This is morally unacceptable to me. They continue by saying, we need first of all to change our approach to research. A key ingredient of the economic engine of medical progress has been the endless issuing of promissory notes by scientists and the medical industry, which are then amplified by the media. The Human Genome Project, stem cell research, highly touted breakthroughs, all have raised hopes that we are on the verge of saving hundreds of millions of lives. But these promises have not materialized. A more realistic rhetoric is necessary, one that places a heavier emphasis on caring for the sick, not curing them. One really has to ask, why have some of these promises not materialized? We do see fairly frequent news reports of scientists finding better ways to treat certain diseases or obtaining a better understanding of the mechanisms by which certain diseases work. This is clearly very valuable knowledge that could be put to use in improving human lives and prolonging them, and sometimes has not been put to use quickly enough. But why is that the case? Clearly, there is an institutional obstacle here. With central government agencies at the national level, like the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, and similar counterparts in the countries of the European Union, that delay the introduction of these life-saving medicines into the market by subjecting them to extremely lengthy testing, sometimes 15 years or longer, and at the same time imposing very unrealistic and indeed detrimental criteria in order for them to receive approval. I will also provide some links to articles that delve into this issue in depth. Obviously, if it takes many years for the FDA to approve a certain life-saving treatment, in the meantime, many people, thousands or even millions, who suffer from diseases that treatment could have cured or at least delayed, would perish. And the FDA approval process will always focus more on the downside risk of approving a drug that has adverse consequences rather than the downside risk of not approving a drug that works and causing deaths in the meantime, because the latter deaths will not directly be blamed on the FDA employees who failed to approve the drug, whereas if the FDA employees did approve the drug and it was a contributing factor in even a few highly publicized deaths, those employees could expect a lot of blame and a lot of career difficulties. Another problem is in the criteria used by the FDA to demonstrate whether a drug is effective. Essentially, the FDA's current criteria require drugs to be targeted toward curing a specific disease. A drug that merely generally enhances human health and well-being by improving a wide range of functions, because it doesn't directly cure disease or cure a specific disease, would not receive FDA approval today. At the very least, those criteria need to change, but my preferred solution is to abolish the FDA entirely and let the free market do its work in bringing the treatments that people want and need to those people. Clearly, human beings are intelligent and they can make informed decisions, especially in matters that are as crucial as their own health. So why not allow them, the patients, to make the decision about whether or not a particular drug will be worth it to them? Nuland and Callahan continue by saying that the traditional open-ended model of medical research, with the war against death as the highest priority, should give way to a new goal, aiming to bring everyone's life expectancy up to an average age of 80 years, already being approached, reducing early death and shifting the emphasis in the direction of improving the quality of life of those in every age group. Now this, again, I find to be morally repugnant. Certainly, the principle of individualism does not allow for this kind of approach, this kind of general leveling, sacrificing the lives of those who could have lived longer so that everybody or almost everybody gets to live until the age of 80. And furthermore, the net result of this approach will be a reduction in lifespans, because they already note that average life expectancies of 80 years are already being approached in our current environment. So what they're just going to do is cut costs so that fewer advanced treatments will be available, and people past the age of 80 will not get the care that they currently receive. And furthermore, anytime somebody speaks of quality of life as being an objective that should take precedence over length of life, I find that to be highly dangerous and morally unacceptable. Of course, quality of life is important, but the fact of life being primary, being existentially prior to any sort of discussion of quality of life, certainly should take moral precedence in every case. Emphasizing quality of life instead of length of life is just a veiled way of saying people should die sooner because some lives are not worth living. And again, for an individualist who believes that life is at the foundation of moral value, and without life, any talk of morality is nonsensical and impossible. Focusing on quality of life over length of life is the very denial of the desirability of prolonging life. They say that the highest priority should be given to children, the next highest to those in their adult years, the group responsible for, quote, managing society. What a high-handed and contemptuous way this is of looking at things. Managing society, rather than cultivating an environment where individual human beings can maximize their potential. And then they say, of course, the lowest priority should be given to those over 80. This is a contemptible mentality. It's a mentality that treats human beings as resources to be used for the sake of a greater cause, rather than as values in themselves. Essentially, they suggest that because individuals who are over the age of 80 are of the lowest use to, quote, society, which should be, quote, managed, they should be given the lowest priority, while those who have the greatest potential to be a resource to society should receive the best, most urgent treatment so that they could fulfill their responsibility to the collective. This is extremely scary social engineering. This is approaching a world where individuals are not seen as being valuable as individuals. A world where individuals would be seen as having to have some sort of external higher justification for being alive. It's a world in which the life of the individual becomes the property of the collective, the society, the government, which inevitably ends up being the few power elites that run the whole thing. Nuland and Callahan continue by saying, death is not the only bad thing that can happen to an elderly person. Well, it's not the only bad thing, but it is the worst thing. And to suggest that anything else that can happen to an elderly person, and certainly there are many sufferings and pains and indignities and diseases that can happen, but to suggest that any of that can somehow make death more desirable is to suggest that some lives are not worth living. And ethically, this is not something that a civilized society ought to accept. And then they go on to reveal more and more of what their true agenda is, which is to create more overarching centralized control, to expand the scope and power of national governments in making health decisions for individuals and in deciding who lives or who dies. They say that instead of a medical culture of cure for the elderly, we need a culture of care. Care, not cure. We let you die with compassion. Notably, a stronger social security program and a Medicare program much more heavily weighted toward primary care. And of course, this means advocating more top-down interventionism. Continue to pour money into programs that have clearly failed and proved to be unsustainable since the days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt for Social Security and Lyndon Baines Johnson for Medicare. So all that they're saying, essentially, is, well, yes, by the standards of that old-fashioned war against death, these government programs have failed to deliver. But if we redefine our standards and focus more on letting people die with compassion rather than actually curing them, then we have a justification of expanding our pet programs once again. And this is really where the importance of an integrated, what I call a genuinely radical perspective on the world, comes to the forefront. It's not enough alone to hold a radical position in one area of human life, such as, for instance, desiring radical human life extension. It's important to think in radical ways about all areas of human life, including culture, society, politics, economics. And it's seen here that if one accepts this status quo attitude of top-down interventionism into healthcare, which has been increasing over the past century at the very least, that begins to compromise other values, such as the desire to extend human lifespans. To consistently argue against people like Nuland and Callahan, one needs to also recognize how programs like Social Security and Medicare, by essentially creating a population dependent on central government largesse, have made it more difficult to provide quality health care, have made it much more costly to provide even routine treatments, and have made the arguments for limiting human life extension much more appealing in the name of controlling costs. Whereas if these programs had never been established, and there had been a direct doctor-patient relationship, where each patient was responsible for deciding ultimately what kind of care he or she wanted, and what he or she was willing to pay for that care, if we had that free market, we would have not only much lower costs, not only a far more advanced medical system with many more breakthroughs already having occurred, but also, ideas like those of Nuland and Callahan would not at all be tenable in that society, because people would say, well, what are you doing trying to restrict me in how I spend my own money to care for my own health in order to extend my own life? They would say to people like Nuland and Callahan, what, you don't want me to live even though I can afford it? And the medical care would readily expand my lifespan. There would be widespread bewilderment and outrage at what Nuland and Callahan are saying here. And today, it takes commentaries like this to maybe try to trigger some of that bewilderment and outrage in people. So Nuland and Callahan want less money for late-life technological interventions and more for preventive measures and independent living. Not that preventive measures and independent living are bad things, but they presume that this is a zero-sum game, and that's the wrong way to look at genuine markets and technological progress, which, as a rising tide does, lifts all boats. They say that some people may die earlier than now, but they will die better deaths. Now this again is a repugnant statement to me. There's no such thing as a better death. All deaths are the same in their ultimate effect, which is the destruction of the individual. And all deaths ultimately are the greatest evil. And we cannot begin to make these comparisons among individuals of, oh, he might not live those extra 5 years, but he will die a better death, so it's worth it. This kind of callous attitude that intercompares human value and tries to make these kinds of vital, in the very literal sense of that term, decisions for human beings, instead of giving them the autonomy to decide what sort of medical care they need and when and how much they're willing to pay for it, that really becomes highly problematic from an ethical perspective. And of course, what Nuland and Callahan's approach would require is rationing. They do not even attempt to conceal that. They propose this system of a pyramid of healthcare, where at the lowest and broadest level is public health, or health promotion and disease prevention. The next level is primary medicine and emergency care. The level above that consists of short-term hospital care for acute illness. And the top, narrowest level is high-technology care for the chronically ill. So this is rationing at its worst. It's rationing by deciding how much care should be provided of each kind, to whom it should be provided, and moreover, it's rationing for the future too. It limits the kind of technological progress that will be possible at this highest level of care by, of course, limiting the resources that flow to that level of care, and limiting what people can do even with the knowledge that they have. It, of course, requires a very static view of the world, and a very static view of available possibilities. They essentially believe that the definition of what constitutes each of these tiers will always remain the same. That just because something is expensive and high technology now, that's how it will always stay. That it won't be thought of as just a routine, ubiquitous procedure in 10 or 20 or 50 years. And this is a highly myopic view. It is indeed the kind of view that attempts to freeze society at its present level of development for the sake of some sort of misguided view of short-term optimal allocation of resources, instead of recognizing that the current scope of possibilities is by far not the scope of possibilities that will be available even a few years from now. And instead of attempting to freeze the status quo or somehow optimally configure it, one should just let these market forces play themselves out and find better ways to improve the human condition. They continue to say that the standards for access to care at the highest levels should be strict, marked by a decent chance of good outcomes at a reasonable cost. And this too is unacceptable. It restricts individual freedom. It condemns people to death in some cases, even if those people are able to pay, even if those people have lots of money. If some functionary of this central government rationing system that Nuland and Callahan propose decides that there's not a decent chance of a good outcome at a reasonable cost, then it won't matter to these people that this person really wants to live, that this person can pay, that this person will gladly pay however much it takes, even for a shot, even if it's not a surefire cure. What sort of mentality would lead people to arrogate to themselves that kind of power, to decide for a complete stranger whether or not that person's most profound hope of getting even a little bit of extra life is worthwhile or not, or should be entertained or not? Clearly, from a consistent standpoint of individualist morality, only that individual ought to be able to make that choice, and can make that choice with any degree of accuracy or any degree of investment in the outcome of that choice. They continue with proposing more top-down intervention, stating that medical education must be better subsidized to reduce the debt of young doctors, which discourages many from entering family practice and tempts them toward ever-narrowing and more lucrative specialties. Now, it's true that medical debt can be crippling for many aspiring young doctors today, and the system of medical training, which is prohibitively expensive and time-consuming in many cases, discourages a lot of entry into needed fields. But once again, the culprit here isn't human choice or freedom or the free market. It's intervention to make the medical system more restrictive. In the early 20th century, the American Medical Association, during a time when quality of life and life expectancy were rising precipitously due to a very free and vibrant market in the provision of healthcare, feared for the livelihood of its members. So the American Medical Association convinced the legislatures at state and federal levels to enact laws essentially granting the AMA a monopoly, barring free entry into the medical market and allowing only AMA licensed doctors to practice medicine. Now, this artificial limitation of supply of medical labor had its problems, as any coercively backed monopoly would. It led to rising costs, restricted availability, and lower quality of the products that were available. Lower quality, maybe not in an absolute sense, because there was still scientific progress and progress in medical technology during the past century, but lower quality relative to what would have been if this monopoly were not in place. So the solution to failed intervention is not more intervention that's just going to generate more undesirable, sometimes unforeseen, sometimes foreseen but ignored, consequences, but rather to end the deleterious intervention that brought this about in the first place. That's the best outcome. So end the AMA monopoly on licensing doctors. Allow a free market system of medical accreditation to emerge, and allow the reputations of medical providers in actually bringing about successful outcomes for their patients to be the determinant of which providers succeed and which providers fail. The AMA in the early 20th century, of course, disguised its attempt at protectionism, as virtually all guilds that try to achieve this monopoly would, via the language of higher standards. They pointed to a few quacks in the field of medicine and said, well, by restricting the field to just our members, we will discourage this kind of quackery. But, of course, no protectionist lobby like this is going to explicitly state that it just wants to limit competition and put up barriers to entry. There will always be this fear that unless this monopoly is given or retained, standards will erode. Well, fortunately, on a free market, standards do not erode because of competition and because of consumers choosing to frequent those providers of medical care that actually offer efficacious treatments. That is the best way to establish a standard that not only is very demanding on healthcare providers, but that continually evolves with the technological possibilities, as well as with widespread public expectations of what constitutes good medical care. Of course, while in a free market, expectations of good medical care will rise. What Nuland and Callahan explicitly say is that the public must be persuaded to lower its expectations. And when I read that, I hear essentially something to the effect of, accept death, you peons. Because that's really what they're saying, in gentler terms. Nuland and Callahan say that the public must lower their expectations of what they're to get out medical care. And, of course, those expectations would not be lowered for the power elites that, quote, manage the kind of highly regimented society that Nuland and Callahan want. Indeed, those people will get the best care, because they are the greatest resources for the collective, according to themselves. No, it's all of you common folk within that system who are going to be shortchanged by being persuaded to lower your expectations. That's really the insidious thing about this proposal. It's portrayed as shared sacrifice, which is in itself quite immoral, but it's really sacrifice of you to the power elites, as all such proposals of centralized rationing and control ultimately end up being. They continue by advocating the suppression of progress. They urge that doctors will have to remind the public that this war against death and disease cannot be won, or can achieve small incremental victories only, and if we are not careful, we can harm ourselves trying. So essentially, they advocate society-wide defeatism, profession-wide defeatism for the medical field. Essentially, a resignation from the great and noble ambitions of the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, whose thinkers finally broke free of millennia of this kind of top-down regimentation and suppression of human aspirations, and figured out that we can do better. Figured out that we can, indeed, by understanding the laws of nature, figure out how to confront and overcome the many miseries that happen to characterize the human condition. Nuland and Callahan want us to reject all that and want to enlist doctors as agents instead of in prolonging human life and combating the perils of it, in counseling acceptance of them and fatalistic resignation that that's just how the way things are and how they're always going to be, because Nuland and Callahan can't imagine anything better. And of course, what do they want? They say the only reliable way of controlling costs has been the method used by most other developed countries. A centrally directed and budgeted system, oversight in the use of old and new technologies, and price controls. Every economic fallacy in broadest terms that one could think of is listed here. Central planning, which, as Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek showed in the early 20th century, cannot rationally calculate what is the best allocation of resources and cannot coordinate all of the dispersed information that exists among the many very diverse actors in any economy. Oversight in the use of new and old technologies. That's essentially technological regimentation, limiting what kinds of technological progress can occur, limiting what technologies can be used on whom, essentially artificially imposed stagnation, the opposite of the kind of progress that lifts human living standards. And price controls. Have these people taken an elementary course in microeconomics? What happens when there's a price ceiling or a price floor? Well, when there's a price ceiling, then demand outstrips supply, and there are shortages. When there's a price floor, supply outstrips demand, and there are many goods that don't get to people who would have benefited from them in a climate of lower prices. And of course, they are opposed to the profit motive. They say that medicine cannot continue trying to serve two masters, that of providing affordable health care and turning a handsome profit for its middlemen and providers. So essentially what they would want is to get rid of one of the primary incentives that people have to do good for other people, which is the profit motive. And oh sure, in their centralized ration system, doctors will receive some level of compensation, which will probably be above average, and they will think will provide doctors with a reasonable standard of living. I'm being generous here. But the motivation that human beings need to take the really entrepreneurial risks and to engage in the kinds of innovations whose payoff is not certain at all, but could radically improve human lives, that kind of routine, comfortable assurance of a nice, modestly good salary isn't going to be enough. In a free market healthcare system, doctors can be entrepreneurs by pioneering a new procedure or by investing in an extraordinarily high quality of care. They can actually dramatically improve the outcomes for their patients, and they can get dramatically higher rewards of doing that, not just by attracting more patients to their practice, but also by serving as examples to others and selling products or selling their advice in a way that is greatly scalable upward. Without that opportunity, many fewer people will innovate. Some people may still innovate out of purely philanthropic motives, and that's of course commendable, but it's not enough. If you want to unleash the maximum level of human innovation, you need to have the profit motive in place. And it's shameful that Nuland and Callahan would seek to suppress it. They continue to say that however a healthcare system is organized, the open-ended idea of medical progress is the deepest driver of healthcare costs. No, no, and again no. The open-ended idea of medical progress is the deepest reducer of healthcare costs. Because only through progress, only through learning more about the world and learning how we can do things more efficiently, can we reduce costs. The direct focus on reducing costs almost never effectively reduces costs in the long run. All it does is limit human options and exacerbate human suffering. The focus on improving the product, making the product more effective, and easier to make and easier to distribute to get to more people to improve their lives, that's what really reduces costs. Like happiness, if you strive for cost reduction directly, you will not get it. But if you strive to lead a good life, you will be happy. If you strive to make a good product, you will reduce costs. They continue to say that, oh, it's terrible that in the last years of life today, many people are frail and walking is even a hazard for them, and they go in and out of doctors' offices and intensive care units, and oh, isn't that terrible? And they say, those results are what progress has given us, a seeming benefit that has become a serious economic and personal burden. Well, I don't see it as a burden. Compared to death, it's a great gift to live those extra 5 or 10 years, even if you do have to watch your step and go to the doctor's office more often. If I had that choice, none of that life, or even a little bit of extra life in that state, I would of course choose the little bit of extra life. And this just underscores the imperative of giving people the freedom to choose. Some people may not choose to prolong their lives, may not choose to get certain expensive medical interventions. And that is their right. I wouldn't do that in their position, but I respect their liberty and their prerogative as sovereign individuals to choose that outcome. But a top-down imposition of rationing, of deciding who lives and who dies, is the very antithesis of morality. And it is also restricting the direct doctor-patient relationship that is the only way of guaranteeing both the best possible quality of care and the greatest possible cost efficiency. The more top-down interventions are introduced, the higher the costs are. Indeed, all of the cost increases that Nuland and Callahan have been complaining about are the result of previously imposed top-down interventions. And now they're proposing even more. And now they're proposing to further disrupt the doctor-patient relationship. No good outcome will ensue. Only a downward spiral. They continue to say that most people today, of course, will viscerally revolt against their ideas, but then they somehow suggest that this reluctance is irrational. They say, well, those people's heads tell them that rationing and limits will probably be necessary, but they reject these ideas if it means that a loved one might not have what is needed to be kept alive, even if in a bad or terminal state. And once again, no, no, no. Rationing and limitations on healthcare are never necessary in a free market where sovereign individuals have the choice of how to use their own resources to achieve their own well-being. There's never a consideration of rationing then. If you can afford a certain level of care and you think it will work for you, irrespective of what anyone else says, go for it. That's the free market. And also, what can help on the free market for those who can't afford it is philanthropy. There are many individuals who might be willing to help. Furthermore, the long-term trend is to drive down costs, so the same kind of care will become increasingly affordable over time. Doesn't mean that everyone will receive the best care all the time, but that's actually the situation toward which a free market will rapidly approach. And it's not irrational or contrary to what people's heads tell them to care about the best outcome for their loved ones. Indeed, as in every case of consistent thinking, reason and emotions are in accord here. If people viscerally revolt against this idea of artificially restricting care to those whom they love, it's not because their emotions are defying their reason. No, their emotions are actually telling them something very rational here. And that rationality is very deep and fundamental. It goes back to the fact that the life of the individual is the highest moral value. And Nuland and Callahan say, once again attempting to salvage their favorite central programs, there is no way the Medicare program can survive unless it both sharply cuts benefits and raises taxes. Certain benefits can be cut directly or indirectly, directly by reducing payments for treatments, or indirectly by increasing co-payments and deductibles to a painful level sufficient to discourage people from insisting on them. Now, this is just a way to make a bad federal government program worse. While currently Medicare might actually provide some help to some people who have been forced through their paychecks to fund this program, what Nuland and Callahan want is just to expropriate that money and not give people any benefits. What I would propose is rather different. Phase out Medicare altogether. End the artificial subsidies to having health insurance. And of course, end the ridiculous health insurance mandates and requirements that employers offer health insurance that have been enshrined in the very wrongly named Affordable Care Act. And instead, go back to a system that encourages a direct doctor-patient relationship without this artificially inflated bureaucratic morass of third parties interfering and making necessarily suboptimal decisions that raise costs and lower patient well-being. That's the way out of this, not the Nuland and Callahan approach of making a bad situation worse. And Nuland and Callahan continue to try to get doctors to talk up their approach toward limiting human lifespans. They say that there is good evidence that if physicians talk candidly and with empathy to critically ill patients and their families, telling them what they are in for, if they want a full-court press, minds can be changed. That in turn means that physicians themselves will have to acknowledge their limits, explore their own motivations, and be willing to face patients with bad news as a way of avoiding even worse treatment outcomes. Now, I would argue that's a violation of the Hippocratic Oath, which says that first a doctor must do no harm. So if a patient wants to be cured or to be treated, to have even a chance of prolonging life, and a doctor actively tries to discourage that, that is an attempt to inflict harm. That is an attempt to go against the wishes of the patient. Nuland and Callahan continue to say that essentially a complete overhaul of the current medical system will be necessary because, they write, the entire web of interconnected, complicating factors has long since reached the bewildering point where no issue can be addressed or so much as approached in isolation. The complexities are enough to make every stakeholder in American medicine, namely all of us, throw up our hands in desperation. Well, I have good news. Maybe not so good for Nuland and Callahan, but good news for the rest of us. The very technological progress that they deride and try to limit is actually something that can get us out of this tangled web, which is indeed quite tangled and messy. But technology has a way of solving problems that, in an environment dominated by previous technologies, might have seemed intractable. A great example, for instance, is what could happen to the issue of abortion if somehow scientists come up with a way to sustain a fetus outside of the womb, allowing a pregnant woman to evict the fetus without killing it, thereby not resulting in the destruction of a human life, at the same time enabling the woman to terminate her pregnancy and not deal with any adverse consequences of that. Wouldn't that radically change the state of the debate on the abortion issue and also the apparent intractability of the problem today? But what do Nuland and Callahan want to do? They say, but there is in fact a solution. A top-down, bottom-up study of the entire U.S. healthcare system with a view toward taking it apart and reconstructing it in a manner adapted to our nation's needs. A multi-year, multidisciplinary project whose aim would be to change the very culture of American medicine. And of course, what they're proposing is not just the study, but the reconstruction of American medicine, the top-down reconstruction that is really a euphemism for central planning. And as great economists throughout the ages, particularly Mises and Hayek, have shown, central planning leads to dismal failure. For all the problems that today's U.S. medical system has, it does have certain market elements that have responded both to good developments like technological progress and to negative developments like federal intervention in healthcare, and has developed imperfect workarounds to those negative developments. If you take down the existing system and remove all of the market adaptations to deleterious interventions, the market adaptations that have in many ways cushioned the blow of those interventions, then what you will get is a system that does an even more dismal job in coordinating supply with demand, meeting people's needs at a reasonable cost, innovating, allowing people to find the system at least somewhat attractive so that they can enter it and earn a living as healthcare providers. All of these imperfectly functioning mechanisms today could be completely ruined by deconstructing and reconstructing the U.S. healthcare system from a top-down approach with the conceit of a central planner, which Nuland and Callahan continue to exhibit all throughout this article. And they say, nor will incremental policy reforms, no matter how well-intentioned, solve these problems. Well, it depends on the kinds of incremental policy reforms. If the reforms are in the direction of liberalization, more individual freedom, more choice by patients, more availability of price menus for patients to actually see what their healthcare costs, encouragement of a more direct doctor-patient relationship, the removal of barriers to technological innovation, the removal of costly approval processes by the FDA, the removal of draconian intellectual property laws that prevent medicines from becoming broadly available at reasonable prices. That kind of liberalization, whether it be incremental or a radical overnight change, would be a tremendous benefit to so many people, and yes, it would be a solution to the messes of our current system. It will both be accompanied by and will, of its own accord, unleash vast technological progress. I find their concluding paragraph quite ironic. They say that doing what they propose will take political will, unyielding leadership, vast amounts of money. I thought this whole concern of theirs was about how to contain costs, both from government and private philanthropy, and extreme patience. Above all, it will take the confidence of the American people that a more humane, more affordable kind of medicine is possible. Well, I will say it is possible, but in order to achieve it, the very opposite set of measures and set of values and shifts in public attitudes are required from what Nuland and Callahan propose. Indeed, this opposite shift would be toward a radically greater embrace of human life, and a radically greater acceptance of the value of the life of each individual. This idea that each person is just a cog in the machine, a mere resource to be sustained as long as it is expedient to the collective and to the powers that be, but to be neglected or even discarded once it becomes old and frail. That resource mentality of human beings is a quite degrading one, but the mentality that sees each human being as an individual who is valuable for his or her own sake, that will really allow people to appreciate the urgency of this fight against death and the value of expanding human life, even if it does cost a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of resources. Even if some gains are only marginal and incremental, this is still the most worthwhile struggle that human beings can engage in. And ultimately, it's a struggle that will transform everything about human society for the better. In order to engage in that struggle effectively, we have to disabuse ourselves of the kind of status quo bias that Nuland and Callahan have. We need to rid ourselves of the idea that just because things have always or recently been a certain way, that they will always be that way, because they need not and should not be that way. Just as people discovered ways to traverse the oceans, or take to the skies in flight, or explore outer space, so this frontier of medical care and human life extension needs to be pursued with comparable ambition. Nuland and Callahan would probably try to defend their case by saying, well, look, we're also over 80 years old, and they are, and we would subject ourselves to the same limitations that we would propose for others. But I'm afraid what I see in that is maybe a bit of resignation on their part. They don't believe that they will personally benefit from the kinds of advances that may be possible in the future. And their perceived limited prospects for themselves are unfortunately, via an article like this one, projected onto what they believe the potential for other people should be. But I don't think that any limits that they might face in their lives should be transferred over onto subsequent generations, and even onto their contemporaries who want to live longer. I think today, if it is possible to prolong the life of an elderly person, then every effort should be taken to do that. And I think Nuland and Callahan do a great disservice to themselves, to their own generation, and to the generations to come in this very flawed and I believe very dangerous and misleading article from the New Republic.